10 ways serial killers tricked their victims. Number 10. Persuasion. How could a man who was 6 foot 9 inches tall, weighing in at over 250 pounds, instill trust in his potential victims? As Ed Kemper, the perpetrator of 10 murders, has taught us, persuasion seems to be the key. Since his arrest in 1973, Kemper has been incredibly collaborative with the authorities, paving the way to serial killer studies. For example, today, knowing that most serial killers have IQ above average is a well-established fact. But back then, discovering Kemper's IQ was 145 was quite a shock. Well, you must be a diabolical genius to convince psychiatrists at age 21 you're no longer a threat after you killed your grandparents at the age of 15, resulting in incarceration at Ascarado State Hospital. I mean, this was the man who was able to convince Aiko Ku, one of his poor victims, to let him inside the car after she managed to lock him out. But what of the other girls? Kemper took his time, about 1 year, to study the subject before putting his thoughts into action. He began to pick up small, pretty female hitchhikers and studied how they reacted to him. He treated each girl as a sort of training, waiting for his moment to strike. Number 9. Hide behind law enforcement. Charles Davis is not as infamous as Kemper, so you might not have heard of him, but still, his criminal mind isn't any less chilling. Davis was active in the 1970s in Maryland, and most importantly, he was an ambulance driver. Davis's killing routine involved stalking his victims until they parked up. Then, using his father's police contacts, he ran the license plate and messaged the pager number, stating they'd left the car lights on. The victim would come back to the car, and that's when Davis would abduct the target. To add insult to injury, he felt so protected by his father's connections, and by his own profession, that he dumped the bodies on open roads on his ambulance route. After all, who would ever suspect an ambulance is carrying the remains of a murder victim? Number 8. The Good Samaritan. Here's another good example of how the people we should trust the most could actually be the most dangerous. John Christie must have known that people, especially those in need, blindly trust doctors. But let's start from the beginning. Christie was born in Yorkshire, England in 1898. He was a quiet kid who suffered from hysterical muteness, which worsened after he was injured as an infantryman during World War I. Since the war hit him so hard, the army discharged him so he could go back home, though he actually moved to London. And what could the city offer a former soldier during 2 world wars? Crime like theft and assault. However, those were petty crimes, and Christie discovered a fascination for murder. Between 1943 and 1953, he killed at least 8 women, including his own wife. How? Christie chose most of his victims among women who needed operations but either didn't have the money or couldn't do it legally. So, even if he had no medical experience, Christie offered his service, mostly illegal abortions, to those in need. By trusting him, they voluntarily fall unconscious before the surgery to never wake up again, because Christie killed them directly afterwards. He was hanged in 1950. Number 7. The Proud Father. When we talk about dark criminal minds, we must include Gary Ridgway, one of America's deadliest convicted serial killers. He claimed to have killed as many as 80 women, although he pleaded guilty to only 48 murders. Ridgway acted during the 1980s and 90s and was dubbed the Green River Killer because he dumped his victims' bodies in the Green River of Seattle, Washington. His targets were women in adult industries because he thought they might not be reported missing. Well, he thought wrong. It was soon clear to the authorities they were dealing with a serial killer. Still, it took 2 decades to finally arrest him. Ridgway was a very skilled manipulator. You would think that, given the nature of those who he stalked, getting them into the truck would be the easy part. Yet some of them were understandably quite reluctant, so Ridgway came up with a trick. He showed them a photograph of his son that he kept in his wallet. Then, once they got to his home, he pointed out his son's bunk bed and toys to put them at ease, before brutally murdering them. Number 6. Please Tutor Me. This is the story of Issei Sagawa, who is technically speaking not a serial killer as he only killed 1 person in 1981, and he's still walking free today, but how did he attract his initial victim? In 1981, Sagawa was pursuing a PhD in comparative literature at the Sorbonne, Paris. He became very attracted to one of his classmates, Renée Hartevelt. He then invited her to his apartment, asking her to tutor him in German. Little did Renée know that Sagawa had planned to kill her. As he was cleaning her body, he realised she was so beautiful that he wanted to eat her. Sick, right? He then put the remains in 2 suitcases and brought them to a large park outside Paris. He was spotted in the middle of the day trying to dump them in the lake. Not so ingenious. He was arrested and ferried back to Japan for the trial that never happened. It's unclear why. So Sagawa turned his fame to adult films in which he would bite his co-stars and even got a job as a sushi critic. Number 5. Magic Trick. Now, if you're not a fan of clowns, especially if you're absolutely terrified of them, discovering one of them was a serial killer may make you feel vindicated. It's another good reason to hate them. The clown of this story is John Wayne Gacy, who killed 33 people in Cook County, Illinois during the 1970s. He was well known in his community as Pogo the Clown, the entertainer for children's birthday parties and charity events. Entertaining was indeed his special skill. He typically lured his victims back to his home to show them a magic trick. He would first place some handcuffs on himself and perform the feat of escaping from them. The victim would then be impressed and ask how the trick was done. Wayne would offer to show them by putting the handcuffs on them, but there was no trick here. Once those handcuffs were on, you were doomed. Gacy came under the suspicion of the authorities in December of 1978, when disappeared Robert Peast was last seen with him. Investigators recovered 29 corpses buried on his property. Number 4. Vacation Trip. We're still in the 1970s and 80s now, prolific decades for serial killers apparently. But we're moving to Anchorage, Alaska, where Robert Hansen abducted and murdered at least 17 women. Hansen's targets were women in adult industries. Hansen chose his victims randomly and didn't even bother too much in trying to gain their trust. Mostly once he captured them, he forced them to act out his private fantasies, torturing them for days, after which he let them free to run for their lives in the wilderness. However, once he noticed he'd gotten away with the murders, he began running ads in a local singles paper, seeking women to share some time together at his remote wood cabin in the Matanuska-Susitna Valley, about 35 miles north of Anchorage. The story doesn't end there. Hansen's sadistic game didn't stop. Once he'd liberated some of his victims, he would hunt them down in the woods, shooting them dead like an animal. He was eventually caught only because the bodies started to pile up in the area. For how absurd it might have seemed to the police, the only suspect was the quiet, local businessman, Hansen. Number 3. The Murder Castle. We've got murders and we have Dr. Holmes, but we're not in London. In fact, we're in Chicago, and the Holmes in question, instead of solving crimes, is performing them. Dr. H.H. Holmes is widely considered to be America's first serial killer. A master of trickery, he even lied about his name. Born in 1861, his real name was actually Herman Mudgett. Over the years, it was said by the press at the time he had built the house that would eventually become known as the Murder Castle. The building was apparently equipped with secret passages, trapdoors, soundproof rooms, doors that could be locked from the outside, gas jets for asphyxiation, and a kiln to cremate the bodies. The skeletal remains of his victims were even sold to medical schools for a lower price. But how did he get someone voluntarily to go there? Well, Holmes tricked his victims by posing as a successful businessman with grand property to his name, often getting them involved in his lucrative business schemes. Little did they know it would be the final business they'd perform on Earth. Number 2. A Dangerous Marriage. Meet the Burneys, Catherine and David, a couple from Perth, Australia, who in 1986 stalked and murdered 4 women, almost killing a 5th. Things usually went like this. The couple patrolled the suburbs looking for women alone, hopefully in need of a ride. Once they'd located the target, the couple invited the girl in their car. It was at this point they'd used Catherine's presence, a woman, to reassure them that it was a safe place. It wasn't safe after all. As stated in police reports, once in the car, the couple would take the victims back to their house, torture them, and ultimately murder them. It was also recounted by the only survivor, Kate Moir, that Catherine would cheer on David, the strongest of the couple, recording him torturing them. As a matter of fact, it was all thanks to Moir that the sadistic couple was finally brought to justice. After the first night in the murderer's house, she was able to make a brave escape the following morning, calling for help at a nearby neighbour's house. Number 1. The Master of Disguise. We've saved the Master of Disguise for last. When we talk about serial killers who eluded the police for years and tricked their victims with a wide range of disguises and charisma, the name that comes to mind is Ted Bundy. Bundy killed about 30 women in Washington, Oregon, Colorado, Utah, and Florida between 1974 and 1978. That's horrifying, especially when you know some of that life could have been spared if the police hadn't missed him when he escaped custody in 1977. Bundy's favourite targets were attractive college women. Among his several tricks, he often wore his arm in a sling or his leg in a fake cast and walked on crutches. His aim was to put the focus on disability and empathy so that, together with his charm, he convinced the victims to unload objects from his car. In other cases, he impersonated authority figures such as police officers and firefighters to gain their trust. Once they got into his 1968 tan Volkswagen Beetle, he would immobilize them with handcuffs. Bundy had strategically removed the passenger seat, leaving a space on the floor for his victim to lie out of sight. So those were 10 ways serial killers trick their victims. Are there any that we've missed? Let us know in the comments down below. Be sure to give this video a like and subscribe to All Time 10s if you haven't done so already for more great videos like the one on screen right now.